With 2 months to go before the Great Tribulation, I decide to give a sermon. The service is held in my basement. The congregation is my neighbor Paul. I clear my throat and glance at my construction paper. I have jotted down some notes. "How would you," I shout, "like to be covered in boils?" "I wouldn't like that at all," he says. A moment later, I return with Mr. Armstrong's booklet, 1975 in Prophecy, and show Paul the illustration that served as inspiration for my sermon. Beneath it, a caption reads, "Unrepentant human beings will be stricken with excruciatingly painful boils, as God destroys the evil works of sinning mankind to bring nations to repentance." I guess there's no iodine in hell, Paul says.
Fell in love with a crooked world and everything that comes with it. I love when you fake it, won't you? I once believed, but I took it all. Left myself with none of it. I love when you take it, won't you?
It used to be only a few years back, if anyone talked about the end of the world, he was called sort of a doomsday crackpot. Today, that is not true.
I'm a creative writing professor at Emerson College in Boston. When I'm not teaching, I'm writing. My first book is about my years growing up on the south side of Chicago. The World in Flames, my second book, begins when I'm 6. It ends when I'm about 16. But I did not want to write that book. I did not want to revisit that part of my life. And yet, as a nonfiction writer, as a memoirist, you have to go where the material leads you, and that was my material.
Christ is coming back to this earth to rule all the nations of this world.
My parents joined the Worldwide Church of God in the late 50s, early 60s. One reason why they joined was because they were told that everyone who had a physical disability would have it eradicated. My parents both lost their sight in their childhood to accidents. And so when they were told about this church, they were motivated in large part by the possibility of seeing their children for the very first time.
The Worldwide Church of God presents Herbert W. Armstrong, internationally recognized ambassador for world peace.
The Worldwide Church of God was a church founded by Herbert W. Armstrong in 1933, in which he preached the world would come to an end in 1975. 1972, the world would break out into famine and wars and drought and plagues and all of these things.
We would be whisked away to this place of safety in the Middle East while the rest of the world effectively died through war, pestilence and famine. That's all very specifically spelled out in the book of Revelation. Our group would be spared that. We would fly on the wings of a great eagle, which is thought to be a plane, to a specific location in the Middle East. We actually named it. It was Petra.
And then in 1975, the skies would part. Christ would descend and give everyone one final chance to follow his teachings. Those who refuse would perish in a lake of fire for eternity. Those who accepted could be saved, but they would be watched over by those of us who had been chosen 3 years prior. So we would be supervisors of the afterlife.
We were part of a McDonald's franchise of religions. Wherever you travelled around the world, you felt like you were with the same people, and there was an absolute American flavour to everything that we did, even though I grew up in New Zealand.
Society as we know it on this earth and civilization as we know it will end.
I certainly didn't choose to be in a religious cult. I was 2 years old. My mum wasn't that religious, when she was growing up, but she did experience the loss of her father at a young age, and that was really a traumatic event for her. There was sort of a cocktail of things going on in society. At that time you had the hippie movement happening, you had a whole lot of sort of free love and free thinking happening, and then, as is often the case, you've got this kind of more conservative reaction to that going on in parallel, people who are sort of resisting that change. I think she was looking for answers and a soft place to land at that time. We prided ourselves on appearing normal. If you were to ask a neighbour who grew up around a member of the Worldwide Church of God to describe that family, they would probably say they are so lovely.
Some voice has to cry out and warn you people of what's going on.
The Sabbath was on Saturdays. We couldn't celebrate Christmas. That was a hard one for me, probably the most difficult. We couldn't celebrate Halloween. We were forbidden from seeing doctors. We were told that if God wanted to heal you, God would heal you. Herbert W. Armstrong believed that whites were superior to blacks. And so he, in many ways, reflected the sentiment of the history of the United States. Heaven on earth would in fact be segregated. Our congregation itself was entirely black, but the church as a whole was probably 95% white. What Armstrong told us was that at the moment when we needed to depart, we were to sell all of our personal goods and to send the money to him so he could buy fleets of jumbo jets to take us all to Petra. Many people sold their homes and their cars and everything that they could get their hands on to send to the church. Some people took a slightly different approach. I heard that some people went on lavish vacations and bought all the things that they'd always wanted to do right before the end times.
When I was growing up, there was a very strong sense of the world is ending, we are the elite, we'll be the only ones that are spared, and then we'll teach those people who are resurrected how to live. I felt like I would never get to experience high school, I wouldn't fall in love, get married, have children. I had a whole lot of kind of question marks around those basic things that people imagine in their future, because we were always on the brink.
Nuclear world war leading to Armageddon and the end of this world definitely is prophesied, and for this present living generation.
There were many dates that got revised.
With cults, you have to build in some flexibility with these dates, or the whole thing will fall apart. So Armstrong was notorious for saying, I did not say 1971, I said possibly. It could be 72, more likely 75, maybe 78, but we won't know for sure unless I have more time to study. I can't have more time unless I have more money. Please send your checks to.
It might be the only human enterprise I can think of that has a 100% failure rate. Every single attempt by a group, an individual, any trend or movement in world history has ended up not, in fact, being the end. One reaction to the failure of apocalyptic predictions that tried to set a date on things. It's basically saying, quit calculating, all bets are off. Number two would be, you made a mistake with your calculations. You need to go back to the drawing board and do your math again. One of the things I specialize in, it would be apocalypticism in the ancient world, and then as it goes through history, how does it adjust to time, and how is it important even today? I could come up with conservatively 50 movements from the time of Jesus up into the 1900s. And when you get to the 1900s, something changed, at least in the United States. So I was involved full in 1993, the Waco, Texas tragedy with the Branch Davidians, that were an apocalyptic, biblically prophetic group and coming from the Seventh-day Adventists.
Branch Davidians are not anti-government. We're not anti-law enforcement. And I'm sorry that there are 4 agents that are dead and there are a lot that are wounded.
I work with the FBI to try to convince David Koresh, the leader of the group, that he should surrender and come out peacefully. And he had his own unique interpretation, and he had come up with the date of 1995. He was thinking it would be 1995. So he wasn't planning to get attacked in 1993.
It is clear that the jury recognized by its verdict that the killings of the 4 ATF agents were not justified.
I do remember in the 1970s, there was a lot of talk with Herbert Armstrong's group, the Worldwide Church of God, as well as the Jehovah's Witnesses, about 1975. So Armstrong put out a book, 1975 in Prophecy, and it was just the most gloom and doom thing you've ever seen.
It's bonkers. It's completely bonkers. To me, I was a kid, so I have a complete excuse. My parents and the other adults, I don't know what they were thinking, that they would think that this was all a possibility. But that's the thing about having a leader like Herbert W. Armstrong. You get the right person in charge of an insane script. The script becomes believable.
He failed as an advertising executive, in fact. He took a lot of those skills and that ambition into the religious environment. By the time he had grown this global group, he had his own media empire and he had a magazine. He was one of the first radio evangelists, and he had a television program that went out globally to many millions of people.
This has been a witch hunt that was illegal. It was an illegal witch hunt. It was illegal. And with all of that, I'm doing fine.
Now, when my book was published in 2016, it was during the presidential election when Donald Trump was running. And I thought, I'm going to be famous. If you look at his tweets, and Trump always capitalizes certain words, Armstrong did the exact same thing with his newsletters. Different words would be capitalized throughout. If he got angry about something, if he got bad press, they're trying to get us, they're trying to take me down. The only thing between you and them is me. They're after me. And I just thought everybody would see the similarities between Trump and Armstrong. It didn't happen, but the similarities are unmistakable.
On January 6, 2021, then President Donald Trump had this big rally, and there, sort of a round of speakers was, using this very sort of apocalyptic language to talk about the 2020 election, which Trump lost, but they were insisting he didn't. And what we saw was extremist groups, paramilitary organizations, and run-of-the-mill Trump supporters that have no connections to these groups going into the Capitol together. Alongside were people that believed in various degrees in QAnon. QAnon is, at its core, a belief that there is both a grand conspiracy theory to destroy the world, and that Trump somehow is the antidote that is going to save the world from this conspiracy that's going to collapse it, or at least make it a really miserable place to live. And there was sort of a small portion of QAnon believers that overlapped with that evangelical base and saw things that Trump was doing as congruent with some of the predictions for the end of the world. That sort of portion of evangelicalism thinks that that revelation would be good, because then all Christians, they'll be rewarded for the way that they've believed. The world is frankly a confusing place a lot of the time. And online, in politics today, there's a lot of people selling an explanation for that. And one of them is that the world is ending.
I just think that there is a formula with these beliefs. That if you can scare people, tell them, yes, you should be fearful, but here's a way you can be saved. That combination seems to work for people.
Anytime there's widespread kind of disaster that involves segments of the population, apocalypticism just rises up again. Everybody starts their calculations. Apocalyptic comes from a Greek word that means to pull back the curtain or to reveal. So it's actually the name of the main apocalyptic book in the New Testament, the book of Revelation. So if you're reading Greek, it would say the apocalypse of John. It's the revealing of the things that are shortly to come to pass. It was written 2,000 years ago, and people reading it back then thought it was near. So you can run that for the last 2,500 years, and you get, the text has stayed the same, but you got all these contexts. And the contexts are fluid and ever-changing. So apocalyptic can be used generically, but the way it's usually used by people who are basing it on the Bible, Jews, Christians, and to some degree Muslims with the Quran, because it has a lot of apocalyptic material, they would all think that we could be near. So it's kind of not a great idea for progressive people who want to see the world maybe solve its problems.
When I was in elementary school, I managed to place high enough on one of those standardized tests that I could go to what was called a magnet school, where the brightest kids from all the different local schools would be brought into one school. I kind of wanted to go, but I didn't want to go, and I spoke with my parents about it, and they wanted me to go. I didn't want to be separated from my community, but I also didn't see the point if the world was coming to an end very, very soon.
Now it's 2,000 years since Christ died. Whoa. So maybe the year 2030 will be the end. My guess is you're going to get quite a few people in the next few years picking that up. So the Antichrist needs to get here right now so he can do his final 7 years. I hate to smile at this because, you know, people take it seriously, and I don't want to make fun of it. But, you know, after a while, believers in the main apocalyptic books in the Bible would say, well, prophecy can't fail because God inspired it. So what is actually failing is our interpretation of it. And if it's 1,000 years, 10,000 years, or next year, does it really matter? So this would be what I call the back burner prophecy. So you see how apocalypticism works, and it's a very powerful force down to this day.
The operating currency of the religion was fear, you know, fear that you might be left behind.
They didn't keep the congregation together with hope. They kept us together by scaring the hell out of us. And often when it was time to go to bed, those sermons would come back to you. I don't recall a day in my life when I was growing up where I wasn't terrified of making a fatal mistake, of committing some sin. I mean, every time there was a thunderstorm, we thought, this is it. This is it. So we lived in constant fear of doing wrong, constant fear of doing right and having these things come to be. It was a tough period to go through as a kid.
I moved to Australia. I had a favourite bookstore. One day I went in to find a travel book, and I happened to find myself in the self-help section, and I saw this book, Combating Cult Mind Control by Stephen Hassan. When I first saw it, I thought, why would I read that? and yet I was drawn to it. On this first page, I opened the 12 signs that you're in a cult. And there's things like they dominate all your time and prevent you from having conversations with outsiders. They command a lot of your resources. And I went through that checklist and I found myself recognising my own life in there, and I was completely shocked. I went home that day, I read it until 3 in the morning, and I basically left the religion. I sort of started a bit of a lifelong investigation and exploration of what that meant and how that had impacted me and how it potentially had impacted many other people as well.
When 60 Minutes did an expose on the church and discovered that Herbert W. Armstrong was in fact pilfering funds from the membership, and leading a pretty extraordinary lifestyle that we had no idea about. People left the church in droves. Even my parents, who stuck through all of the scandals, they decided at the time had come that they would leave the church. I was 14 and it was kind of a mixed blessing. I was grateful the world wasn't about to end, but I was also crushed because everything that I believed about life was contained in that church. And so when the church fell apart, I fell apart. And when you're 14 years old and all that you've believed in your entire life was taken away from you, you've got to fill it with something quick. When I found myself hanging out with gangbangers, they kind of shared the same philosophy. We're not guaranteed a future. Like, we are going to die young living this lifestyle. So in some ways, it was an easy transition for me to leave the church.
In the United States, the Pew polls are done regularly on religion, and an astounding number of people say, I think we might be living in the end times predicted in the Bible, if that's the question. It talks about asteroids. It talks about roaring of the waves of the sea. It talks about whole species dying. And we're actually seeing some of that happen, a lot of it happen. We're just living in an apocalyptic time, let's face it.
We had an opportunity to visit Petra, to go to this place that I had been promised would be my home for a few years. And in some ways, it was cleansing, and it made it all clear to me that this was never a possibility. It was also maddening to, again, think that people thought that we were going to live here. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But I'm glad I went. I'm glad I went. In that way. The good way.
I went through a couple of decades trying not to think about issues like the world ending, but it's very hard to avoid that thought if you care about society, you know, you care about your children, when we're staring in the face of dramatic climate change.
We're going to have to face up to our future at one point, so we might as well do it now before it's too late.
What do we want? Climate justice! When do we want it? Now! If we don't get it!
I was very mindful and aware of that younger generation feeling such a sense of despair and responsibility over the future of the planet. And I wrote a piece paralleling my experience growing up with an end-time mindset with Gen Z and younger, and what it might be like for them. They may have a lot of anxiety, they may have a strong sense of pointlessness about their future, and we can forget what it might be like for young people. And there's a constant sense of something's terribly wrong on the planet, and we're constantly being told effectively that the world is ending. I know the impact that that can have.